Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of The Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast out. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Our first story is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and the 2 years it took to rebuild. Patron Driven is out now, wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, however, we're going to be talking about the future of vocational education. My guest is Dr. Rupert McLean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on the technical and vocational education and training. Dr. McLean, based in Australia, currently divides his time between Melbourne, where he's an adjunct professor in the School of Education at RMIT University, and Hobart in Tasmania, where he runs the Education Innovation for Development Consultancy. He's been a chair professor of international education at the Hong Kong Institute of Education and a director at UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, among many other higher education and international agency positions. Dr. McLean has also produced an incredible volume of research on education, including Education for the Changing World of Work, with a special focus on technical and vocational education. He has developed 2 international handbooks, the 6-volume Handbook of Education for the Changing World of Work, and the Handbook of Technical and Vocational Education and Training and Research. He's the editor or co-editor of 3 international book series, all of which have been published by Springer Nature, the sponsor of this episode. In this 4-episode series, Dr. McLean and I talk about some of the defining moments of his tenure at UNESCO, the impacts on the world of work due to the shift from manufacturing to the information age, global trends in technical and vocational education, and why countries must provide equitable access to education. In this 3rd episode, Dr. McLean talks about how to increase equitable access to education and how this can help balance the scales of economic opportunity. The economic inequalities between and within countries are increasing, where the majority of economic growth and wealth is going to the wealthy, which is a very small portion of any country's population. But so how do we create equitable access to a quality education? How does that work?
Well, we must first of all have a commitment on the part of countries that they want to have development which benefits all sections of the community, not just a small group who get wealthier and wealthier. One of the ways in which we can actually try and achieve more equitable growth and development, where there's greater justice and fairness and things of that type, is by having high quality education systems where we give access to all sections within the community. Because, currently in many countries, women and girls don't have the same access as boys and men. Those living in rural areas don't have the same access as those living in urban areas. Some racial groups, ethnic groups have much better access than other ethnic and racial groups. So we have to look at what we can do to have education and schooling that is of benefit to all sections of the community, give everyone a chance to develop their talents to the full, and to also gain from the economic development potential of their particular country. So education and schooling are seen as the key to such development. Now, for example, if we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, these were established in January 2016, we find there are 17 goals. And these are things that all sections of the community should benefit from. So there are goals like everyone should have access to clean water, which of course we take for granted now in developed countries, but this is not available to everybody in the developing world. We've got 17 goals in terms of food security, in terms of access to clean water, about empowerment, individual empowerment, equality, equity, and so on. And one aspect of that is access to a high quality education for all. And that's absolutely crucial. It could be seen as the master key. There are 17 sustainable development goals. Each of them provides a key to development, but a master key provides entrance to many different, opportunities. And education is the master key. And this is seen as being crucial to achieving the other UN Sustainable Development Goals. And these are goals that all countries throughout the world, 193 countries, subscribe to, support, and are trying to work towards achieving.
So in countries where, for example, like the United States, where it's it's expensive to attend a college or university, um, which I would guess is kind of had an impact on the vocationalization of education, where students choose a focus of study based on its return on investment. How more specifically can enabling equitable access to education help balance the scales of economic opportunity?
Well, I think it's very important giving people equitable access. But then we have to also look at, is that going to be at the cost of society? Are the
Mm.
taxpayers going to pay for it? Or do people have to take large loans? Student loans are a big issue, aren't they? Where people have to borrow money, large amounts of money, which they have to then repay once they gain employment.
Yeah.
So, what should be the funding arrangements for education and schooling? I think we accept in most countries that primary schooling should be at the expense of the society as a whole through
Uh-huh.
the tax system. As we move up the system and we get into higher education, often people have to pay fees and so on to university to cover their own costs because they're seen as being the beneficiaries of the education. As a result of studying and developing the skills for a particular occupation, their salary will be higher than would otherwise be the case, and therefore they should actually fund that themselves. But getting that balance right between what people should pay for individually and what the society should pay for is a very important dialogue that has to be worked out, and not to saddle people with enormous debts which they then have great difficulty paying off in the future. So this is the sort of dialogue that has to occur between the various interest groups in society.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, is in our previous conversation you and I had, you had talked about sort of the idea in sort of capitalistic societies where it's sort of this individual individualistic approach to education and the job market and sort of sort of a bootstrap approach or whatever that tends to be kind of the way folks um, hope to progress and advance their careers. Um, and that can, in some ways, I think, work against a more universal kind of tax-based approach, I would think, to education.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's an excellent report that's been written looking at this very issue. It's called the Delors Report, and it's called uh, Knowledge, the Treasure Within. And it looks at what sort of education we should have for the 21st century and how do we cope with the tensions that exist in our various societies,
Mm.
particularly during a period of rapid change. Like the tension between individualism and the interests of the group. There can often be a tension.
Yep.
Often Western societies are highly individualistic, highly competitive, where the individual is the major player. There are other societies, for example, in parts of Asia, where the major concern is with the interests of the group. So, how do we get this tension right between individualism and meeting the interests of the group? How do we get the tension worked out between tradition and modernization? Um, we want to maintain our cultural heritage, our cultural characteristics. At the same time, we are modernizing and changing. And this can really, in some societies, undermine the
Mm.
taken for granted values and ethic considerations, within that society. So these are some of the things that have to be worked out. And I would recommend anyone who's interested to look at the Delors report, which provides a blueprint, suggested blueprint, and identifies the main parameters and concerns and issues when it comes to education for the 21st century.
Okay. Can you spell that? The name of the report? So
Delors, Delors, Jacques Delors,
okay.
was the chairman of a committee that was looking at education for the 21st century. and UNESCO was the organization that facilitated that particular inquiry. The book was published end of last century, but is just as crisp and fresh today as it was when it was first published. And the book is available in many different languages, not published by Springer Nature, but published by UNESCO.
Okay. So obviously there's an obvious focus on young students coming through the educational system, but what about, I'm curious about older mid-career adults right now who may be in danger of being undertrained for this new vocational landscape that's rapidly approaching, if it's not already here. What's being done or what can be done for that part of the population?
Well, this is where the lifelong learning issue becomes very important, where people have to be given the opportunity at various stages in their lives to update their knowledge, to develop new skills and so on. This is partly done by employers, of course, but also partly done by government, giving people opportunities. And with the information and communication technologies that are available, this doesn't only occur through face-to-face contact between learners and those who are guiding them, but also by utilizing the internet and the sort of facilities that are available on the World Wide Web. So this is something that people need to be motivated to do, to upskill and improve. If I think of an analogy, there was a period many years ago when I was a teacher where typing was the key thing, and there were occupational groups called, who worked on repairing typewriters. Well, typewriters are not used very much these days. People who were involved with the repair and maintenance of typewriters, if they hadn't adapted to the changing technologies and the fact that typewriters were no longer the major way of producing written documents, well, then they would have just not be able to function. They'd have to develop new skills, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But we can think about this across the board, where people are in occupations that are going out of favor, are no longer required, and they have to retool or re-skill themselves to actually be able to meet the changing job market needs.
Yeah, I don't want to date myself too much here, but I can remember having to take typing tests
That's right.
when I was looking for jobs in my, when I was beginning my career.
But of course, keyboard skills are still very important, but you're not using a traditional typewriter. You're using a word processor. You're using a laptop and so on.
Exactly. You just heard from Dr. Rupert McLean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on technical and vocational education and training. This episode was brought to you by Springer Nature. Join us next week for our final episode when Dr. McLean and I talk about how COVID-19 is highlighting the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of our educational systems, as well as the lasting effects the pandemic will have on education.
And also, it's reminded us that although we can learn things through access to our computers and the World Wide Web, that face-to-face contact is still very important because, teachers contribute a lot in terms of their interaction with their students. The human aspect of education, not just the knowledge transfer aspect of education and schooling. So, as I said earlier, I think it's really made us realize just how important teachers are. But to realise that all things that we learn don't need to mainly, when it comes to schooling, occur through face-to-face contact. We can also become independent learners using the internet, working from home, harnessing the new and emerging information technologies. So I think it's going to result in a major rethink of the modalities for teaching and learning.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.